the difficulties that the Fatimids were facing in North Africa and Syria from the Abbasids. Ultimately, they were losing ground and they were being defeated. So the Nisaris were a revenge phenomena against the head of the Sunni establishment. Their most notable assassination was of Nizam al-Mulk in the year 1090. That assassination set into motion the First Crusade, which took place 9 years later. Undoubtedly, one of the most able administrators that the world of Islam has produced since the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. After that, they also engaged in the assassination of Muhammad Ghori, who, as you know, was the person who conquered Delhi in 1192. They assassinated him in the early part of the 13th century. At one point, they even found themselves in the tent of Salahuddin Ayyubi. But because of the fact Salahuddin Ayyubi had conquered Jerusalem, whether it was by change of heart or because the guards were alerted, or because Salahuddin Ayyubi talked the assassin out of it, he escaped the assassin's blade. And this mayhem went on for a long time, encouraged by the Crusaders. They're very much interested in weakening the Islamic world. And invariably, they went for the head. The Arabeg of Mosul, I forget his name now, was another one who was assassinated. That paved the way for the Crusaders to march through eastern Anatolia, northern Syria, and Palestine on to Jerusalem, or at least to try to conquer them. So the issues had to do with the rivalry between the Shias and the Sunnis, and specifically in the 9th and the 10th and the 11th century, the rivalry between the Sevener Shias, the Fatimids, and the Sunnis. Now, in this tussle come the Turks, specifically the Seljuks. The Seljuks, having consolidated the power in what they used to call Khorasan, which included western Afghanistan, the territories of Central Asia, of which there are 5 or 6 kingdoms now, and portions of Iraq and Iran, they came to the defense of the Abbasids. So the Abbasids and the Seveners, which is the Fatimids, through another Shia branch called the Buyuts in southern Iraq, they were engaged in a tussle for almost 50 years for the control of Baghdad itself. Now, it's hard for people these days to understand how great a challenge it was, because around the year 1050, the Fatimids controlled all of North Africa. They did not control Spain, but all of North Africa, all of Egypt, all of Syria, including Jerusalem, including the Hijaz, which is Makkah and Medina, and they even control portions of Central Asia and Multan in Pakistan. They too. And in Afghanistan, Herat and the western Afghan area. So the tussle between those two was galactic. If you remember all of this, you study it carefully, you'll understand why it was that Mahmud Ghaznavi raided India, etc. That's going to take me off on the side. Let's stop it. One thing relates to the other. Inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem. It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this 7th of our series on science from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, history, science, and the soul in Islam. And as we said last week, we're going to focus on why it was that the scientific revolution did not take place in Islam. We are all very fond of reciting and recapping the glorious days of Islamic civilization, when Baghdad was the capital of the world intellectually, and so many centers of learning dotted the Islamic landscape all the way from the borders of China to the borders of France. Question is, what happened? How did it all disappear? And what needs to be done so that perhaps we can renew, that's the right word, renew Islamic civilization based upon knowledge. By way of introduction, some statistics that are well known to you. In the last 100 years, there have been 900 or so Nobel laureates. Of them, if my memory serves me right, there have been 9 who have been Muslim. 6 of these Nobel laureates were for peace, bringing peace to the world. Only 3 were in the area of science, and all of them were educated abroad in America or Europe. If you look at the list of the top 300 universities in the world today, I don't think there is even one from the Islamic world that would be counted in there. People of ability from Muslim countries compete with one another to find their way to the shores of the United States or go to Europe, or nowadays maybe even go to China. Get out. That's the state of affairs. And if you want to look at what is happening at the ground level, for instance, in Kashmir, only 47% of the women are literate. Literate, which means to be able to read and write your name. 47% only. 53% are illiterate. Of course, there are other reasons, but I'm just giving you some statistics in here. So the state of the Ummah, from an intellectual perspective, is not something that we can boast about. We have to be honest and recognize for the situation as it is so that we can ask ourselves what happened, what is happening, and perhaps devise strategies, structures, and implementations to correct it to a small extent or a large extent. In the next 45 minutes, all I can do is to give you an overview of what happened. To start with, it is incorrect to say, as do so many people, that the period of science and technology disappeared with the Mongol invasions. People think of the classical Islamic civilization that say it ended with the fall of Baghdad in 1258. That is not so. Science and technology, with some qualifications that I will mention later, did continue to thrive and prosper up until the 18th century. And I'll give you some examples. I wonder if most of you know the connection between the American national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the contributions of a Muslim king, Tipu Sultan. Here are the details. The British and Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan fought 4 major battles in southern India. In the War of 1799, Tipu Sultan fell. That is well known. What is not commonly known is that Tipu Sultan was a technology buff. He engaged in many innovations. One of his innovations was the invention of a rocket. Abdul Kalam, who is considered the father of Indian rocketry today, has said that Tipu Sultan was the father of modern rocketry. Why is that so? It is true that the use of gunpowder was known through the Chinese by both the Europeans and the Muslims, as well as other peoples. However, most of the so-called projectiles those days used a casing of plaster in Europe. What happens with plaster is the plaster is not strong, so when you develop pressure and ignite the gunpowder inside, it explodes. And that puts a limitation onto how far you're going to shoot the rocket. The European rockets had a range of about 3/4 of a kilometer. Tipu Sultan replaced the plaster with cast iron, enabling the buildup of higher pressures. And then to the front end of the iron castings, he attached bamboo, which is available in plenty in southern India. Bamboo is a very strong orthotropic material. I will not go into the details of what orthotropic is, etc. I'm not going to go into that. It's a very specialized field. Take it from me that the material is capable of sustaining humongous pressures. Indeed, the British used the bamboo to build their so-called Bangalore torpedoes against the Japanese in Malaya at the time. So he put the bamboo, and at the end of it, he had a payload, which was another bamboo pole attached outward to it and swords attached to it. Unfortunately, the payload, that was all he could muster at the time. And he could shoot his rockets to a range 2 to 3 times that of the European rockets. 2 to 3 kilometers. And indeed, it was these rockets that enabled Tipu Sultan to defeat the British in the War of 1780 at Polilur, the only time the British were defeated on Indian soil. And they dropped their guns, ran away. Only time. If you want to put things in perspective, that was 23 years after the fall of Bengal in the Battle of Plassey. So when Tipu Sultan died, the British took the rockets, brought them to London, and had their scientists work on them. Colonel Congreve was one of the scientists working on solid propellant rockets, which means gunpowder, in London. Since he was familiar with Newton's laws of motion, he added some fins to stabilize the trajectory of the rockets and improve and increase their range. And these rockets were used against Napoleon in the War of 1806. So when the British attacked America in 1812, in the War of 1812, burned down Washington, D.C., they proceeded up the Chesapeake Bay to bombard the Fort Baltimore. And by this time, this was in 1814, the war had been going on for quite some time. There were many prisoners, many people were hurt. So there were these 2 lawyers whose names should be known to people of American history, Scott and Skinner. They, after consulting with the American generals, went to the British to arrange a ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners. So they board the ship in Chesapeake Bay. The names of the ship and the generals and so on, I have them all recorded in the encyclopedia. You can go read it. These 2 gentlemen, a general and a commandant of the Navy, were planning the invasion of Baltimore. And since these 2 lawyers heard what was going on, the plan, the general saw fit to keep the 2 lawyers on board until the bombardment of the war was over. At least that battle was over. So on the night of September 13, 1814, the bombardment began using the Congreve rockets that the British had brought from India. And the explosion of these rockets and the fires and the brilliance that it created inspired, was it Scott or Skinner? Scott. Inspired him to write the Star-Spangled Banner. So if next time you read it, understand where the rockets are coming from. connection between Islam and America. People know about the King of Morocco. People don't know about Tipu Sultan. Very organic. So the world of Islam was not behind in technology until the 18th century. Another example, going back now. Akbar, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, invented a gun with a barrel length of almost 6 feet. And it was so precise it could take down a target at a distance of 300 yards, 900 feet. Another example. People read about history, see, but you also should know, why did, for instance, someone prevail over another? It was not just as our mullahs stand up and say, faith, faith, faith. True. There is technology involved. There is organization involved. Babur, for instance, built his bows out of composite materials, which were available in plenty in Afghanistan. When you build something out of composite materials, you can pack a lot more energy into it when you stretch it, so that when you let go of the arrow, it travels farther. The range of the arrow was as much as the most famous British bow and arrow. However, the bow of the Mughals was lighter, more compact, and easier to carry. So these people, the Mughals, could shoot one arrow after the other against their enemies, and hence their triumph over their foes, all the way from Lahore to what is today Bangladesh. Islamic empires were not behind the Europeans. The Ottomans excelled in metallurgy, in casting. And their casting technologies, their guns, were well known in Europe. The Europeans were concerned about the technologies that the Turks had at the time. And that's what explained how it was that they managed to conquer all the way to Vienna twice, 1526 and to 1683. That's by way of introduction. So once again, the question is, what happened? What I'm going to do is to give you an oversight of how it is that technological developments and contractions are determined by conceptual, ideological, technological, social, and military events. All of them go into technology. And don't forget economics, because without money, you can't do anything. We all know that. You need money. It has to move. So let's go back and review what happened. And what I'm going to do is to share with you my observations on why it is that we are here, so that you don't get lost in the details that I give you. I have submitted to you, and I submit again, and I presented this in my khutbahs. Muslims do not understand the Quran. They don't read the Quran, they don't understand it, they talk about it, they don't understand it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sanurihim ayatina fil afaq. Wa fi anfusihim hatta yatabayyana lahum al-haq. Here are the keys to science, history, and tasawwuf, and their ultimate purpose, which is to find al-haq, the truth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, soon I shall show them my signs on the horizon and within their own selves, until it is clear to them, until it is certain to them that it is the truth. Allah created the heavens and the earth as signs. There are signs in there. Allah says, look at the signs so that you find the truth. Truth means, it has many different meanings, but al-haq is Allah. But truth also means the truth. It may be partial truth, complete truth, but the ultimate truth is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, look at my signs. And Allah says, I'm going to show you my signs in human history. I will show you my signs through the people of the Pharaoh, the people of Ad, the people. So half of the Quran is history. Read it. Signs. The Israelites, look upon them as your teachers, not as your enemies. Ho, 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 ho. It happened to them. No. What can we learn from them? No. Learn from them.
A lot of Israelites are not true.
So the thing is, I submit, part of the problem, young people, is that we don't read the Quran. You should study the Quran. It's all there. You don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to it. It's all there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that. Same thing with history. Allah says, travel through the earth. How many of us, when we travel through the earth, we go to eat, I don't know, when you go to France, you go to eat whatever. You go to North Africa, it's couscous. You go to Pakistan, you eat biryani. No. The purpose of travel is to visit places that have been lost, been destroyed because of what those people did. So we learn from them. And within yourselves, how many mullahs stand up these days and say, anything related, tasawwuf for instance, bad name. The greatest compendium of knowledge in the world is in the sciences of tasawwuf that was developed by the Muslims. And we say, no, I don't want it. I'll give you an analogy. Imagine a man who has been given a large room as a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in this room, I'm going to build a huge door for you. And the door has a person standing there who will guide you inside. And this room and the other three walls will have large windows. Through one window will come in all the beautiful sounds of nature. The second window, all the lessons you want to hear from history. And the third window, through them, you can hear your own voices from within, your own souls. And this man in here, first, he closes one window because he says, well, I don't want to hear the nature. He closes one window. Then history stopped with whatever year, 760, I'm going to close that window. And the soul, well, that's haram. Close it completely. 3 windows closed. Then he closes the door because he doesn't want to read the Quran. The person standing there is none other than our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the door that is open is the door of the Quran. And Allah says, I will give you these different methods so that you understand what the truth is. So you give. We forgot that. Please remember that. Now let's go back. What happened to Islamic civilization? Very briefly, we have touched upon some of these things. First, there was the explosion of knowledge after the Prophet ﷺ. The Sahaba, the Tabi'in learned what the Prophet had taught, and Islamic civilization exploded for 50 to 100 years until they came in contact with the philosophy of the Greeks. We have gone through this. They adopted it because of its precision and its power. And the Khalifa in Baghdad, Khalifa al-Mansur, made it the dogma of the empire. But they did not understand the limitations of philosophy. Reason is the most noble gift Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to humankind, except the heart. They did not understand the limitations of it, overextended themselves, applied it to the Quran, didn't understand it, fell flat on their face. And we saw how the opposition to the Mutazilites came from the Usuli ulama. the Mujtahideen. Imam Hanbali fought a running battle with the Mutazilites, was whipped, put in jail, was abused along with all of the other ulama of the age until the year 846. Baghdad said, enough is enough. We are going to say goodbye to philosophy. What is the lesson here? The lesson is that the challenge to the Mutazilites did not come from within. It came from the Usuli ulama. So what happens is the Usuli ulama were triumphant, and philosophy thereafter was always looked askance with what got to watch those guys. Even to this day, when I mention the names of people such as Al-Khwarizmi and so on, I hear some of my brothers amongst the Muslims say, oh, they were not Muslim. This is what I have heard with my own ears. And certainly the Fatimids, they were not Muslim at all. This is where we are. Unfortunately, many people succumb to those kind of views. So, the Mutazilite eruption set in motion a major wave which reverberated through the Islamic world for 500 years. We also saw the response of Imam Ash'ari, who, in order to reconcile faith with reason, advanced the proposition that time moves in discrete steps, atomistic steps, and at each step, the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervenes to make things happen so that we don't have to make assumptions about where does the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intervene to make things happen. It all revolves around the question of cause and effect. They, the great scholars that they were, did not understand the limitations of science, and one after the other, great as they were, and great as their contributions were, proved to be insufficient for the modern age. Comes Al-Ghazali. We talked about that. The great man, the greatest man, the most influential person in Islamic history. Times were very turbulent at the time. Remember I pointed out it was the heyday for the assassins. The Crusades had started from Europe, now coming to the Middle East to conquer Jerusalem. The Shia-Sunni stuff was still going on. So Imam al-Ghazali was involved in a two-front war. One war was against the Fatimids, against their doctrines, against their belief systems. And if you read carefully his writings, you will find coherent, cogent arguments from the Sunnah perspective as to how it is that the belief systems of the Fatimids are incorrect. The second war was against the philosophers. And he shows from his logic, and he studied philosophy, became a master of philosophy. And he said, the position of the philosophers is incoherent. If he had stopped there, it would have been great. But he went one step further. He said that there is no such thing as cause and effect. And I'll read to you the appropriate passage from his writing, because it is very important for us to understand the kind of impact that his writings had on the subsequent development of science and technology in the Islamic world. This is a translation from Al-Ghazali, Imam Al-Ghazali, the great man that he was, upon whose shoulders we stand, the great, great man he was. He says the connection between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary. For any two things, it is not necessary that the existence or the non-existence of the one follows necessarily from the existence or the non-existence of the other. Their connection is due to the taqdeer of Allah, who creates them side by side, not to its being necessary by itself. As to what it means by side, it baffles my mind. You cannot write off time with a stroke of pen saying that they're created at the same time. Time is there no matter what theory you come up with. You come up with a string theory, classical theory. Time you cannot get rid of. It's a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so that we get to know through His creation something of His names and learn to serve Him. Imam al-Ghazali, a great man he was talking at that level because he looked at philosophy through the eyes of tasawwuf. Whereas up until the time, tasawwuf was being looked at through the eyes of philosophy. He turned the tables on them. But he was misunderstood. And Muslims said, well, there's no such thing as cause and effect. It's all the taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's go to sleep. He will make things happen. He does make things happen. But the secret of creation is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to discover what it is that He has in store for us. Otherwise, see, that argument, human beings cannot learn. You cannot say, whatever Allah does happen. It does happen. There's no question about it. But if you're lazy, you discover your lazy fate, and that's what Allah prescribed for you. If you're hardworking, you're smart, you become the greatest person in the world, you discover your fate, that's what Allah has prescribed for you. That was Imam al-Ghazali. He too did not go unchallenged. Ibn Rushd of Spain challenged his writings, Tahaffuz al-Tahaffuz, around the year 1200, in which he showed the preeminence, the importance of reason. But unfortunately, the Islamic world did not listen to him. Europe listened to him. Because by the year 1200, remember, much of central Spain had already falling to the conquistadores, the Crusaders, after the fall of Toledo. So if you look at the establishment of universities of Oxford and Cambridge and Rome and the University of Paris and the old universities of Germany, they were all established in that period. Europe was waking up. Ibn Rushd became the champion of the Europeans, whereas Ibn al-Ghazali became the champion of the Muslims. One civilization adopted this thinking, another civilization adopted that thinking. So in summary, the summary of the classical tug of war that took place is the following. Europe and the Islamic world faced the same questions and came up with different answers. The first to encounter rationalism, that's reason, were the Muslims. First they adopted it, then they rejected it. Not only did they reject, they persecuted people who disagreed with them, flogged them, put them in jail. Then they tried to accommodate it through the writings of Imam al-Ash'ari. Great contribution there. Then came along Imam al-Ghazali, and he said there's no such thing as cause and effect, except that it is perceived to be like that. The Europeans came across all of these writings, plus the writings of the classical Greeks in the 11th century, and they said, we are going to make the assumption that religion and science are separate. That religion does not belong to the sphere of science, and science does not belong to the sphere of religion. Divorce. And they took off in a secular direction. That was the 12th century. The assumptions that the Europeans made were very different from the assumptions that we as Muslims made. And we are still struggling with it. One of the things that I have tried to do in my Encyclopedia of History is to establish that connection once again, to show that Allah's creation is that arrow, that pointer to the presence of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that Science and faith are not disconnected. Science becomes a servant of faith, unending search of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through history and the creation of Allah. So that through those signs, unending science, limitless science, Inna a'tainakal kawthar. Indeed, I have given you kawthar, kathir, from the word kathir. They interpret it in different ways, meaning boundless. Have I not given you? Have I given you? Allah has given us boundless science. That's what I have tried to do. Now, what are some of the other reasons? After the Mongols and the Crusaders, who destroyed much of the Islamic world, you know the Muslims lost Spain, but they gained back Jerusalem. And we covered the rise of the Turks and how the Turks ultimately not only overcame the Crusader challenge, but they advanced to capture what is today Istanbul and Eastern Europe. We know all of that. The civilization that rose after the Mongol invasions was different from the civilization, the classical civilization of the Arabs. The classical civilization of the Arabs was exoteric. It had in it an amalgam of both the esoteric as well as exoteric. The civilization that came after the Mongols had more of an esoteric component to it, because most of the ulama had been destroyed. The libraries were gone, and the center of gravity shifted to the Persian-speaking world. So that if you study literature after the year 1314 or so, you find as much great literature in Farsi as you do in Arabic, not before the year 1300 or so. Maulana Rumi, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, Sheikh Shaduli, he wrote in Arabic. And other greats in India, we know them. They all spoke and wrote in Farsi. And they were all men of the heart, the soul. And it was Tasawwuf that conquered the Mongols. I gave you the name of Baraka Khan the last time. The man who was converted in 1252. And you made the difference between the Mongols becoming Muslim and the going off becoming Christians. This civilization produced great works of astronomy, mathematics, and artisanship. The Taj Mahal, product of this age. The Blue Mosque in Istanbul, product of this age. The mosques in Isfahan, products of this age. The Registan complex in Central Asia and Samarkand, product of this age. Islam thrived in sub-Saharan Africa. Timbuktu grew up to be a great center of learning. Great mosques went up in Africa and in Europe. Muammar Sinan, product of this age. Ahmed Lahori, who was the architect of the Taj Mahal and other buildings in Agra, product of this age. This age excelled in mathematics and astronomy. There were so many observatories that were built in Iran, Central Asia, for a couple of years in Turkey, and that's another story, I don't want to get into it. And in India, one of them is still standing in the center, the heart of Delhi, the Jantar Mantar so-called, built in this age. But then something else happens. Islamic civilization takes a turn. If there is no other date that you want to remember, remember the year 1683. When you grow up, study about it. 3 things happened in that year, 1683. What was the year? 1683. 3 things happened. Number 1, Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, published his laws of motion. Secondly, the Turkish armies, having gone to the gates of Vienna, suffered a defeat and retreated, never to go back. Third one, in Agra and Delhi, Aurangzeb published his Futuwat. Islamic civilization took a turn from the soul onto the observances of what they perceived to be the Sharia. And after 1683, the next 100 years, if you look at Sheikh Abdul Wahab of Arabia, and about 150 years later, Usman Dan Fodio of Nigeria, you'll see the same thrust of a shift of Islamic civilization from the soul to outward observations. And it was this civilization, the latter civilization, that came up against the expansive power of the merchant economies of Europe. The explosive energy of the joint stock companies and so on met up with this internal looking, do this, don't do this. This is okay, this is not okay. And it still goes on. The tensions introduced internally into the body politic of Islam sapped its energies, and instead of people asking themselves, what is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What are the signs in nature? What are the signs in history? What are the signs in my own soul? They started to ask themselves, is it okay to wash your hands up to here? Is it okay to wear a hat like this? This is not a good hat. This is what, and it goes on to this day. That's historical. And the end result was that they found themselves in the clutches of Western civilization, which had gone on and had adopted science and technology, adopted the printing press. Remember, I pointed out the Muslims resisted the printing press for 300 years, for God's sake. 300 years they said, no, we don't want the printing press because we don't want the Quran to come in contact with a wooden block. The mullahs. And in India it was even worse. And India was the first non-Western civilization to fall to the Europeans. They found themselves under the heels of the Europeans, who destroyed whatever remained of the Islamic educational system, because their purpose was to train these Babu Sahaban, the people who do the administrative work to continue their empires, the British and the French and the Dutch, and to a lesser extent the Europeans and the Americans. They were latecomers to this game, only in the Philippines. So that the educational system, the attitude, the orientation of the Muslims, the way the society looked upon sciences and the exposition of the sciences were all inimical to the development of science and technology. It was only in the latter part of the 19th century you see some awakening. You say, well, we're falling behind, we got to do something. So Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in India, in around 1880, and even Al-Azhar begins to change and stir. The Tanzimats of the Ottoman Empire, they tried their best. Too late, too little. Continue to lose. So we come to the 20th century, with most of the Islamic world under the heels of the West, bereft of science, bereft of the knowledge of the Quran, bereft of the guidance that the Prophet ﷺ gave us when he said, go to China if you need to acquire knowledge. China was not an Islamic country, folks. It was some other country. The Chinese used to eat pork. The Chinese used to eat pigs. The Chinese, whatever they did to survive. And yet the Prophet ﷺ said, if you have to gain knowledge, go to China. Such a great man, such a great human being, such an open-minded person. And I'm speaking only from a scientific point of view. He was great. He was the prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, go to China. What happened to us? In the 1920s, you read that the Muslims, when they lost their technical edge, they said, these sciences are coming to us from the Firangis, don't study it. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the the founder of Aligarh Muslim University, if you read his history, you will cry. They made him ride a donkey. They threw shoes at him. They threw garbage at him. Why? Because he was trying to found a university that would teach the ways, the sciences of London and Cambridge and Oxford. This is what has happened to us. So understand how it happened. And how do we get out of it? First, and this is the summary. I repeat for the young people, make friends with the Quran. It is all there. And after you have studied the Quran and made it your own, then study the seerah of the Prophet. Remember I described to you the difference between the seerah and the sunnah and the hadith? The methodology of the Prophet. It's all there. Then know your history. Know how you got here. You are the inheritors of a great civilization. A great civilization that founded the sciences, produced the greatest of the earliest scientists and historians. You are the inheritors of great doers. Get to know your history. Get to know your spirituality. There is no, I can say this with confidence, there is no other civilization that has produced the depths of understanding of the soul as has the Islamic civilization. What is wrong with us that we say no to knowledge? Allah gives us knowledge, we say it's haram. What has happened to us? Allah gives us science on the horizon, we say that no, don't look at it. Allah shows us science through the history of the Israelites. No. Just follow me. Give me your money. We need to get our orientation back to the orientation of the Quran. Secondly, we need to honor people of learning. Remember the age of hikmah. If a man like Al-Razi were to show up today, how would we treat him? I have known situations, not a Nobel laureate, a well-known professor and a mullah show up on the stage at the same time, and the entire crowd follows the mullah. I can show you example after what has happened to us. Honor knowledge. Knowledge is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not inherited. It is not given to you by virtue of your inheritance. Doesn't matter whose son you are or daughter you are. Allah gives to whom He pleases. Honor people of learning. Third, encourage those who are successful. Don't pull them down. When a boy or a girl, young man or a young woman does well, honor them. Bring them here to the centers. How often do we do that? We should honor them, sir. Board of directors. Once a year at least, bring them in. Make them stand up. Give them some gold coin. Those who achieve, so that they remember it. I remember when I got the first rank to the state in 1952, so many honors from our own people in the masjid, outside the masjid. I remember that. Those were the people those days. Honor those. And lastly, and finally, and once again, I conclude my presentations by asking you to always study the Quran. Please, for God's sake, read it, study it. Every word of it has a lesson in it. Every word of it is light. Every word of it will show you the way. Therein is the key. You're looking for the key? It's there. The key is there. It's been my pleasure and privilege to spend the last 7 sessions with you. Inshallah, we'll meet again. As you know, time goes by. I am 78 years old, and my health is what it is. And inshallah, if there are additional questions, needs, especially for young people, as long as I'm breathing, I'm available to share what little I know to the people. It's a beautiful thing. Try to be a man of hikmah, not a specialist. Be a doctor, but also be a person who knows history and science. Be an engineer, but also a person who knows hikmah, the Quran and the Hadith. Be a person who is a person of wisdom. The thrust of the Quran is hikmah. Allah is the Al-Hakim. So I ask you to be like that. Now there's time for a couple of questions. I'll be happy if I know, I'll answer. Sir.
With full respect to you, I'm 71 years old. And what you're asking me to do at this age of my life is not tenable. I'm being honest with you. You're asking me to go back to the Quran and read it. I think that in the world there has been too much of reading of the Quran. Who is going to interpret to me the seerah of the Prophet? Because I keep reading it all the time and every day. Who is going to interpret to the young man who's a rickshawala? Who's going to interpret to the fellow who's a school teacher? What exactly are you going to derive from the Quran? I think the literalism of the Quran, which has gone down all these years, is probably been holding us back in chains.
That's a very good question. The Quran is its own interpreter. The Quran grows on you. It is not by one reading. The way you would read it at age 10 is not the same as the way you would read it at age 70. Every time you read it, it opens up your eye. It's like, for instance, someone dilating your eye. The first time you look at it, it's so wide, and then it's dilated, it's so wide, and then another door opens, and a third door, and a fourth door, until you come to a word such as bir, and you say, Ya Allah, I see a whole universe in it. And I've known people who literally swoon at a single word of the Quran. There was in the Museum of Art in New York one time, I came across a copy of the Quran, and the Khatib, he was writing, and he comes across one word, and he's so overwhelmed, entire page, he fills it. So the answer to your question is, if all of us read it, when we get together, we can talk about it with knowledge. Instead of he said, and he said, and he said, and he said, which is valuable, we would say, the book says this. For instance, I'll give you a good example. There's nothing in the Quran about so many things. So many things we say part of Islam is not in the Quran. Show me type of stuff. So we will discuss it on the basis of knowledge. And out of this knowledge, yes, there are scholars. There are people.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
So in conclusion, yes, there will be scholars who have studied in depth, and they will illuminate us with their understanding of the ayahs from the Quran. However, if we have not read it, how would we know whether what we are hearing is consistent with at least the basics of the Quran? That's my premise. There's time for at least one more question, sir.
So you read out the statement by Imam Ghazali about cause and effect. I assume that's or at least that thought is a very important principle on the basis of which science was, relegated in the Islamic world. Is that? Could you just illuminate that a little bit?
Yes. He was misunderstood. He was obviously, when you hear a great man, he was speaking on the level of philosophy, but when philosophy descends into the domain of ordinary people, it's misunderstood. But it's the way it is written, it's not helpful for scientific investigation. I wish he would have stopped at that sentence and not written something like that. There is no cause and effect in nature. That challenged the scientists in subsequent generations. If there is no cause and effect, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate decider, He is. There is no question of it. But there are so many ways of approaching it. The way of the Quran is through the, I will show you my science on the horizon and within your own selves until you have certainty about the truth. Question from the ladies. At least one, and we'll go. Last question from the ladies.
Well, it's not a question, but it's overall we are still the ummah of Iqra. So,
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. I'm grateful. Yes, I'm grateful for your participation. This has been a very good group. It has stuck together for so many sessions. And this is the smallest number that we have had, but usually we get about 30 people, and very educated, highly motivated ladies and men. And inshallah, who knows, the light will be lit and you'll go on and light it with other people.
Do you also do other things, like not just like what you did this time? It was very knowledgeable and everything. But like my kids are asking about the partition, I mean, unfortunately, I lost my parents, so I could not go back and ask them the questions. So is there a way we could hear something about
Sure,
that?
I have written about it. First of all, I would ask you to introduce them to the Encyclopedia of Islamic History. There's a very detailed exposition of the partition of India that I have written, balanced. History of Islam is one word, historyofislam.com. And then, if there is interest from the young people, I'd be most happy to get together with them.
I mean, I'll be like...
Absolutely. If there is sufficient interest, I'm at your service.